Hello and welcome. This last weekend, we were treated to a demo for Anthem, the next release from BioWare, that we really have seen the last time in E3 of this last year, where I made a video covering what we saw from that little vertical slice. The demo covered a few gameplay missions and a free roam content, and released across Xbox and PlayStation hardware, as well as a rather substantial 40 and some gigabyte download available on EA's Origin platform. In spite of the hecticness of that small window for play, we at DF did manage to get some time in with a couple of PC configurations to gather performance impressions here on PC. And to discuss this, I'm joined by my colleague, Richard Ledbetter, who helped me and gathered some footage. So, how you doing there, Rich?
I'm doing absolutely fantastic, Alex, and congratulations on that intro. It was awesome.
Thanks, Rich. But like I was saying, you and I played some co-op here on PC in a variety of configurations, and but you are covering the console versions of this game. And what were your impressions there mainly?
Yeah, essentially the impressions are, I want to play this on PC.
Yeah.
Because, I played it on Xbox One X and PS4 Pro. Both of them have performance issues. In 4K modes, they can drop beneath 30 frames per second, get to the mid to low 20s when things are really, really hectic. It looks quite beautiful, but I'm not sure if I had, a 6 teraflop GPU that I'd want to use those system resources
for that
on resolution, which brings us on quite nicely to our plans for covering the PC one.
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of lackluster performance on console and that odd little 1080p mode there on PS4 Pro gives us the idea to actually target 1080p 60 on a variety of configurations with this demo, trying to get there because it feels best. It honestly looks great. The game looks, I think, better at a higher frame rate here, quite a lot better, and feels better to play. And so that was our plan, basically. And we started initially with mid-range components that we've used in our testing across pretty much all PC titles since I've started working here at DF, which is a GTX 1060 and an RX 580 running on a Core i5-8400. And you and I both played the game separately and then together in co-op, doing a number of missions together. And the first thing that we noticed is that 60 is basically off the cards right when you start up the game. In the initial hub section of the game, just walking through it, you're going to see dips into either the high 40s or 50s on both of these cards. But then you get into combat itself, and that's where it really shows how heavy this game is on the GPU.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing here is that BioWare is targeting 30 Hz on console, 30 frames per second. So, typically, the Frostbite games that we usually play are targeting 60 on the consoles. So, obviously on the PC side of things, there's kind of more room for those mid-range GPUs to be able to deliver not just 60 frames per second locks, but also ultra settings.
Yeah.
And we should expect it to be more challenging to hit 60 frames per second with everything ramped up with a mid-range Nvidia or AMD GPU. Thing is, we didn't quite expect it to be this challenging, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you were just saying, what we're seeing on consoles, though, is kind of a step up from like Battlefield games or Battlefront games. There's that, frustum-aligned voxel fog that's used in Frostbite, but very rarely in those games, and a couple of other settings, and just the general world size is so much bigger with that 30 FPS target. And it shows. I mean, in firefights on the RX 580, which is, we expect this card usually to, do really well in Frostbite titles on ultra settings. It's in the 40s mainly in a lot of areas, mainly when there's lots of effects going on screen.
Yeah.
And just even running through the overworld, you're constantly below 60 FPS on most points.
And of course the GTX 1060, in common with other Frostbite titles, I guess the last one we would have tested would have been Battlefield 5, it's even lower than that.
Yes.
Significantly so.
Unfortunately, we did lose our footage for this in a certain way due to gremlins. We would have a nice dual head-to-head here, but there was some complications with that footage that we only found out after the fact.
Yeah.
But that's kind of those mid-range cards, and it seemed like for the most part that the CPU was not getting in the way for the most part. The idea then after that was then to turn down settings to see what it would take to actually bring them up to 1080p 60. On medium, we did not achieve that, and then we dropped it down to low, which does quite a lot. This demo, I kind of feel like the graphical options are seemingly lacking or not doing as much as they should, because when going from ultra to high, there was almost little to no performance improvement just in this scene right here. There's slightly different looking shadows and a very odd change to ground displacement where ultra looks less vertically displaced than the high does in the distance, almost like ultra's a lower setting. I'm not sure what that's about, but basically going from ultra to high didn't really do much of anything. Only when you go down to medium do you start seeing a great cut of settings where HBAO turns to SSAO, which is really lacking in coverage, and when it's there, it's just kind of like a halo, a gray halo. And then you also see massive reductions to shadow resolution into the distance. Some objects lose shadow completely, anisotropic filtering goes down, and there's also a further reduction in ground displacement. That brings, in this scene, around 18% performance. It goes up by 18% essentially. Ultra to low is a massive call to settings, and so dropping down to that, we thought we would be getting 1080p 60. There's no anti-aliasing, there's no SSAO, there's barely any ground deformation. It's incredibly low in terms of shadow resolution. There's even less shadows cast from object. No motion blur, no depth of field, very poppy LODs in the overworld. And in this scene, we're still seeing only about a 21% increase in performance. That puts it into perspective. And so when we started playing on basically 1080p lowest settings on these mid-range GPUs, we were above 60 for a good amount of the time, I would say. But it wasn't stable. On the GTX 1060 and the RX 580, we were still dropping frames below 60, specifically in firefights, kind of where things get hectic and effects and alpha is thrown all over the screen. And I saw a number of parts where I was just playing in the overworld by myself on the lowest settings, and it was dropping into the low 50s. And that's not really what you'd expect for a game that kind of looks like this. I mean, if you put it next to the ultra settings, it looks pretty rough.
It's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Because, you know, the RX 580's got 6 teraflops and you can't get 1080p 60 on low. And I think worse than that is that it's ugly with a capital F. And it really isn't good. We really, it's kind of like ultra or bust, really. I mean, you could have high, but there's not really any sort of benefit for dropping to high. Certainly, I mean, obviously the code apparently isn't finished, but the scalability that we're seeing here isn't exactly exceptional, and there's not even the internal resolution scaler slider.
Yeah, that's a, you know, like, we're used to pretty great menus in Frostbite games. There's no DX12 option here. There's no HDR controls. Like, when you start up the game, it's just in HDR, and to get it not be in HDR, turning it off in Windows did not work also for me, by the way. I had to turn it off directly on my monitor or my television itself to get it to not be in HDR. That's not that great. But so we couldn't get it there. We want to move up to the next range of cards with the GeForce GTX 1070 and the Vega 56 series from AMD. And we bumped it up to Ultra again and started playing. And so on the AMD side of things, right at the beginning of our cooperative play here, things were looking pretty great. But right away, the NVIDIA GTX 1070 is basically below 60 FPS for a majority of the play. And you can see it throughout the entire play here, and especially in fights with like larger effects and monsters in the way. What do you think that's about exactly?
Well, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Just to highlight how we did the testing here. Alex is in Berlin, I'm in the UK, and we were playing in a co-op game. We both captured our feeds with FCAP for proper frame time analysis, and essentially we then synchronized them and put them side by side. And I think this is a pretty awesome way, actually, of testing GPUs, relative performance of GPUs within a multiplayer game, because you see everything in context. So in the initial area, which is the kind of like the complex overworld, I think what surprised me based on our testing with the 1060 and the 580 was that the 1070 actually holds up fairly closely to the Vega 56, which in general benches around 10 to 12% faster than the 1070. So, you know, in the overworld, which is kind of like really complex and a sort of a demanding workout in some respects. The 1070 is holding up pretty well there, but you're right, it's certainly not a locked 1080p 60 Ultra, though the Vega 56 seems to have more overhead there, and it's above 60 frames per second for much more of the time. Now, when we move into the second internal area, this is fascinating because on the console side of things, on the PS4 Pro, if you run this area in 1080p mode, which is unlocked, you actually get much higher frame rate. So I'm suspecting that this area just generally has, a lower level of complexity compared to the overworld. Kind of makes sense when you look at it. And here, the Vega really opens up its lead over the 1070, which kind of sticks where it was before. So it has much more overhead for dealing with the effects work when those intense firefights kick off. So, again, this is an interesting thing from my perspective, because let's say you were going to do an Anthem benchmark. If you did the overworld, the 1070 in the Vega 56, not too bad. But if you were benching that internal area, the Vega 56 is miles ahead. I mean, it's insane. So, historically, I've got a bugbear about how accurate benchmarks actually are. And I think, we learn much more about GPUs and their respective capabilities by looking at stuff like this, where it's actual gameplay, it's in context, and you can kind of see how things shift according to what is actually being rendered, what the engine's actually doing. The bottom line is that the AMD side of things, we don't have day one drivers, obviously, yet, although I believe AMD did have an Anthem driver for this one.
Which is kind of funny because we also noticed on AMD hardware there were some graphical bugs here and there, like the bloom effect going kind of crazy and whitening out the entire screen with little black squares and things like that.
Yeah, even on the title screen.
Yeah, even on the title screen, yeah.
Which kind of says to me, didn't anyone look at this?
Yeah. But still, that it's doing really great on AMD, but we did see a couple moments where it would bottom out in the middle of a firefight into the mid-50s, or even a little bit lower. Like here, we're fighting this giant enemy crab boss, and we have this GTX 1070 footage here, and it's in the 40s. Low 40s.
So by any chance, does that tie into massive damage?
It does. Massive damage to NVIDIA's profit margin. So we couldn't get it on Ultra, basically, for these mid-range cards, and we see a varying level of performance based upon what's happening on screen. Overworld, closer, in tighter combat scenarios, the Vega 56 pulls ahead by a good chunk, actually. Would you really want to drop these graphics lower, though, based upon what we see on medium and low? I don't know. They look really rough.
No. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to take a closer look at the individual settings and also the high setting, because it's, if you look at what high does versus ultra in Battlefield compared to what's happening here, something's not quite right here. And as I said, the game isn't really finished. But you actually tested it also with an RTX 2080 Ti at 4K, am I right?
Yeah, I did. And I was actually, based upon my experience with the Battlefield series and Battlefront series, and knowing what we had already on the GTX 1070, I wasn't expecting a locked 4K 60 at all on ultra settings, and that was the truth. Just running around here in the overworld, there's already drops below into the 50s, and you get into a firefight, and it's mainly in the 40s the entire time. John Linneman, our colleague, also played on
his 3840 by 1600, I believe, his lovely ultra-wide there.
Yeah, and he was saying mainly in the overworld and in the hub area it was 60 FPS for him, but as soon as you get into firefights, it's dropping frames quite heavily under 60 FPS at that resolution, which kind of doesn't surprise me. That's kind of the performance profile for all the cards in these games. There's a kind of a wild difference between getting into firefights when there's lots of alpha on screen and versus when you're just walking around in the hub, or sometimes even in the overworld itself, like we described earlier with the GTX 1070 and Vega 56. I kind of want to say that they should have done a different level of optimization in this game, because that's where the game really is. It's in the shooting areas, and to have such wild performance differentials, I don't know. We've played other games like this, like Destiny, and most recently, what's it called, Warframe, and they tend to have really great performance throughout the entire set of play, especially on PC, I feel. And seeing a game like this, which targets, very similar gameplay, having more variable performance, maybe they should have been less ambitious with the graphics and a couple of other things. That's kind of how I feel right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the bottom line is that in a shooter, well, there's two things. First of all, you need consistent performance. The idea that, when you're in a firefight, you're losing response and visual feedback, it does not compute. And that's just not good at all. And then, yes, you look at the competition, Destiny and Warframe, etc. They do scale up beautifully, but the bottom line is that you can get consistent frame rates on pretty, low-end hardware. Like GTX 1050 would be enough to run Destiny beautifully at 60 frames per second. So the idea that they would double down on visuals and just kind of like leave the user to essentially upgrade if they want to have a really, really smooth performance, that's a bit of an issue for me, really.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other general issues. I feel the HDR one I mentioned earlier. You and I both had a very strange issue with CPU utilization skyrocketing to 100% and tanking performance. And for you, it just eventually stopped, like it was decompressing something in the background. But for me, it kept going for minutes on end until I quit the game. And then we had another weird moment where basically in this game you're actually loading a surprising amount in the overworld, or even in missions when you go between one area of a mission and another. It kind of loads you in and out just to do a small task. And at one moment, Richard loaded into the area slightly before me. I loaded in, and then when I walked forward again and he was still in that area, I had to load again. Very weird, kind of unpolished feel to that kind of gameplay loop, where you're in the middle of a mission and you're loading. It just feels like it's not completely baked in this form that we've seen right now. And I hope that's better in the final product.
Well, fingers crossed on that.
Fingers crossed on that, all right. And but I think that's been enough for now. We've talked enough based upon our experience with the demo. And I really do hope that this video gave you a great first impression on how we felt about the Anthem demo and what we should hopefully look forward in terms of improvements for the final product. And if you did like it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell button in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to discuss Anthem in its demo form and what your performance was on PC, well, write a comment below or follow myself and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Richard and Alex.
Something about Alfreda Zane? Yep, that's it.
Thank you, Tara.